Between 1935 and 1938, a serial killer murdered and dismembered at least 12 victims, only of 2 which were ever actually identified. This killer is officially unidentified and this case still remains unsolved to this day. However, there are researchers who are quite certain of who it could be. Cleveland was a city that was becoming more than just a place to live. It was booming with increasing population, immigrants from around the world joining different workforces that served the industrial and manufacturing economy. While the city was improving economically after being hit hard by the Great Depression, someone was going around committing heinous crimes, distracting the city from its pride and prosperity that they had built. 13 people were brutally murdered over the course of 4 years, starting in the year of 1934. All of them were decapitated, most of them while they were still alive. Then, just as they had begun, they abruptly stopped. However, Safety Director Eliot Ness claimed to have solved the crimes, even though there was no official suspect identified and no one was actually brought to trial. Eliot Ness is an American prohibition agent known for his efforts to bring down Al Capone. The Kingsbury Run is a prehistoric riverbed. Train and rapid transit tracks still run through the area. The Kingsbury Run was a dark and dangerous place in the 1930s. The area just east of the run was known as the Roaring Third, police precinct home to bars, brothels, flop houses and gambling dens. In this grim setting is where the most notorious crimes took place. September 1934. A young man found the remains of a woman in her mid-30s, the torso with thighs still attached, but amputated at the knees, had washed up on the shores of Lake Erie. Cuyahoga County Coroner A.J. Pierce noted that a chemical preservative was present on the skin which had turned it red, tough and leathery. The subsequent search yielded a few other body parts, but unfortunately her head was never found. The woman was never identified and then referred to as the Lady of the Lake. It wasn't until 2 years later that was included in the official killing total as victim 0. For the investigation to officially begin, it would actually be another year, and the next time it was in another part of the city, where the Kingsbury Run was located. September 1935. 2 teenage boys discovered a decapitated, emasculated corpse of a white male at the base of Jackass Hill, where East 49th Street dead ends into Kingsbury Run. The body, naked save for a pair of socks, was clean and drained of blood, with rope burns around both wrists. Coroner Pierce determined the cause of death had been decapitation. Fingerprints had identified this victim as Edward Andrassy, a 28-year-old male who frequented the Roaring Third. Police had discovered a second body nearby when they were searching the crime scene. It was also decapitated and emasculated. It was covered in the same chemical preservative as the Lady of the Lake. Apparently, this body had been dead for at least a couple of weeks. The 40-year-old male was never officially identified. January 1936. A woman had discovered parts of a woman's body neatly wrapped in newspaper and packed in 2 half-bushel baskets. The baskets were left alongside the Hart Manufacturing Building on Central Avenue near East 20th Street. The rest of her remains, except for her head, were recovered about 10 days later in a nearby vacant lot on Orange Avenue. The cause of her death was again decapitation. However, the killer waited for rigor mortis to set in before disarticulating the rest of her body. Cleveland police used fingerprints to identify victim number 3 as Florence Palillo, a waitress and a barmaid who at the time of her death resided at the edge of the Roaring Third. June 1936. Early one morning in the Kingsbury Run, 2 young boys discovered the head of a white male wrapped in a pair of trousers close to East 55th Street Bridge. The next day, Cleveland police found the body of a 20-something-year-old man dumped in front of the Nickel Plate Railroad police building. Clean and drained of blood, the corpse was intact except for the severed head. Coroner Pierce again said the death was by decapitation. In spite of a fresh set of fingerprints and the presence of 6 distinctive tattoos on various parts of the body, police were never able to identify him. He was named the Tattoo Man. A death mask and the tattoos were made of plaster and then displayed at the Great Lakes Expedition of 1936. They are now on display at the Cleveland Police Museum. July 1936. A teenage girl came across the decapitated remains of a 40-year-old white male while walking through the woods near Clinton Road and Big Creek on near west side of Cleveland. The victim had been dead for about 2 months, and his head, as well as a pile of bloody clothes, was found nearby. Judging by the enormous quantity of blood that had seeped into the grounds, the man had apparently been killed where his body was found. He was victim number 5, and he was never identified. September 1936. A man tripped over the upper half of a man's torso while trying to hop a train on East 37th Street in the Kingsbury Run. Cleveland police searched a nearby pond, which was nothing more than a big open sewer, and found the lower half of the torso and parts of both legs. Police then sent in a diver to make the recovery. There were over 600 onlookers watching this grim discovery, and the killer may have been amongst them. Victim 6 was in his late 20s, and the cause of death was again decapitation. Coroner Pierce noted that there was a lack of hesitation marks in the disarticulation of the body, which indicated the killer was strong, confident, and he was very familiar with human anatomy. The victim died instantly when the head was cut off in one bold, clean stroke. Victim 6 was never identified. In the fall of 1936, the media was going crazy reporting these 6 brutal killings in 1 year, and the police, who had no idea or any suspects for them. Almost daily, there were reports on the killings, and the lack of suspects and tensions were definitely getting higher. This was where Elliot Ness was appointed to get more involved into the case by the mayor. Coroner Pierce called for a torso clinic meeting, which is what the newspapers were calling the killings. Essentially, in this meeting, there were police officers, the coroner, and other experts who then discussed the information they had and were trying to create a profile of the killer. The police department put detectives Peter Merlo and Martin Zalewski on the case full-time. They moved swiftly throughout the underworld that constituted the Run and the Roaring Third, often dressing the part while off duty. By the time the case was full speed ahead, they had interviewed more than 1,500 people. The department as a whole was more than 5,000 people. This would be the biggest police investigation in Cleveland history. In November, Coroner Pierce was replaced by a young Democrat, Samuel Gerber. He had a fierce dedication to medicine, coupled with his law degree, put him at the forefront of the investigation. February 1937. A man had found the upper half of a woman's torso washed up on shore east of Rottenell. Unlike the previous victims, the cause of death for this victim had not been decapitation. This had happened after she was already dead. The lower half of the torso washed ashore 3 months later on East 30th Street. The woman was in her mid-20s. Victim 7 was never identified. June 1937. A teenage boy discovered a human skull under the Lorraine Carnegie Bridge. Next to it was a burlap bag which contained the skeletal remains of what turned out to be a petite black woman about 40 years old. Dental work allowed for the unofficial identification as Rose Wallace of Scoville Avenue. Police had followed every lead they had had on her. It led nowhere. July 1937. There were labour problems in the Flats, which was an area along the Cuyahoga River near Lake Erie, in the summer of 1973, and the National Guard had been called in to maintain it. A young guardsman standing watch by the West 3rd Street Bridge saw the first piece of victim 9, bobbying in the Cayuga River while a tugboat had passed. Over the next few days, police recovered the entire body, except for the head. The abdomen had been gutted and the heart ripped out, clearly indicating a new element of viciousness in the killer's approach. The victim was in his mid to late 30s. Victim 9 was never identified. April 1938. A young labourer on his way to work in the flats saw what he at first thought was a dead fish near the banks of the river. With closer inspection, it turned out to be the lower half of a woman's leg, the first piece of victim 10 to be recovered. A month later, police pulled up 2 burlap sacks out of the river containing both parts of the torso and most of the rest of both legs. For the first time, Coroner Gerber detected drugs in the system. Were the drugs used to immobilize the victim, or was she an addict? The answer may have come if they had found the arms, but they didn't. Victim 10 was never identified. August 1938. 3 scrap collectors foraging in a dump site at East 9th and Lakeside found the torso of a woman wrapped in a man's double-breasted blue blazer and then wrapped again in an old quilt. The legs and arms were discovered in a recently constructed makeshift box wrapped in brown butcher paper and held together with rubber bands. The head had been similarly wrapped. Gerber noted some of the parts looked as if they had been refrigerated. While searching for more pieces, the police discovered the remains of a second body just yards away. These 2 bodies had been placed in a location that was in plain view from Elliot Ness's office window, almost as if the killer was taunting him. Neither victim 11 nor 12 were ever identified. August 18th, 1938. At 12:40 a.m., Elliot Ness and a group of 35 police officers and detectives raided the homeless encampments in the Kingsbury Run. 11 squad cars, 2 police vans, and 3 fire trucks ransacked the makeshift shacks where the Cuyahoga River twists behind Public Square. They worked their way south through the run, gathering about 63 men. At dawn, they searched the deserted shanties for clues. On orders from Elliot Ness, the shacks were set on fire and burned to the ground. The press severely criticized Ness for his actions. The public remained afraid and frustrated. Critics said the raid would do nothing to solve the murders, and they were right. July 1939, County Sheriff Martin O'Donnell arrested 52-year-old Bohemian bricklayer Frank DeLezel for the murder of Florence Palillo. Frank had lived with her for a while, and the investigation revealed he had been acquainted with Edward Andrassy and Rose Wallace. His confession, however, turned out to be a bewildering blend of incoherent ramblings and neat, precise details, almost if he had been coached. Before he could go to trial, Frank was found dead in his cell. He had hung himself from a hook only 5 feet 7 inches off the floor. Gerber's autopsy revealed 6 broken ribs, all of which had been obtained while in the sheriff's custody. It is said few believe Frank was the torso killer. However, Elliot Ness had a suspect who he thought without a doubt was the killer. The suspect apparently continued to taunt him years after the killings had stopped. All official police records on this case have been lost, destroyed, or removed. Now, who was the torso killer? It has not officially been solved. Many believe the identity of the killer has been known since the 1930s. Mysterious Dr. X was investigated by the police and interrogated by Elliot, but there was no physical evidence that would link him to the crimes. Most likely, Dr. X was Francis E. Sweeney, an intelligent, skilled, and very troubled surgeon who lived near the Kingsbury Run. Dr. Sweeney had the surgical knowledge as well as access to facilities suited for dismembering bodies. Despite a week-long interrogation by Elliot and other high-level investigators, Sweeney never actually confessed. However, immediately after Sweeney committed himself to a sanatorium, the murders completely stopped. And months later, after the last victim was found, a letter was sent to the Cleveland police. It was written to the Chief of Police, Matowitz. "You can rest okay now, as I have come out to sunny California for the winter. I felt bad operating on those people, but science must advance. I shall soon astonish the medical profession, a man with only a DC. That did their lives mean in comparison to hundreds of sick and diseased twisted bodies, just laboratory guinea pigs found on any public street. No one missed them when I failed. My last one was successful. I now know the feeling of Pasteur Theroux and other pioneers. Right now I have a volunteer who will absolutely prove my theory. They called me mad and a butcherer, but the truth will come out. I have failed but once here. The body has not been found and never will be, but the head minus features is buried in a gully on Century Boulevard between Western and Century Crenshaw. I feel it is my duty to dispose of the bodies I do. It is God's will not to let them suffer." Do you guys think it was Dr. Francis Sweeney, or do you think it was someone else? Let me know down in the comment section below, and I'll see you for the next video.